Bavaria, May 1945. The war was over, but not for them. Two sisters stood in a stone corridor, pressed against each other like shelter against a storm. The older one, barely 16, whispered instructions through cracked lips, while American boots echoed closer. She gripped her sister's hand so tight the bones touched. Outside, through narrow windows, spring sunlight touched mountains that had watched empires fall. Inside, fear settled like frost. The younger girl nodded, tried to swallow, couldn't. The door opened. Light flooded in, harsh and final. The town of Berchtesgaden sat cradled in the Bavarian Alps, like a secret kept too long. By the first week of May 1945, that secret had been pried open by American forces, who poured through its streets like water finding cracks. The mountains stood silent, ancient witnesses to history folding in on itself. Snow still clung to the highest peaks, but down in the valleys, spring had already begun its work, turning mud to earth, death to memory. In those chaotic days, the American 3rd Infantry Division moved through the region with methodical efficiency, processing thousands of civilians, sorting truth from lies, collaborators from innocence, dangerous from desperate. They had established temporary interrogation centers in requisitioned building schools, hotels, government offices, places that had once served ordinary purposes, now converted into machinery of justice and documentation. Greta Hoffmann was 16 years old. Her sister Anna was 12. They had been born into a world already at war, their childhoods measured not in school years and summer vacations, but in ration cards and air raid sirens, propaganda lessons, and missing fathers. Their mother had died in the winter of 1943, typhus claiming her in 3 days of fever that no doctor would come to treat. Their father had been taken east in 1941, somewhere near Smolensk, and had not returned. For 2 years, the sisters had survived alone in their mother's cottage on the outskirts of Berchtesgaden, existing in that strange space between childhood and necessity. Greta had become mother, father, provider, protector roles too heavy for shoulders that had barely finished growing. Anna had remained a child only in age, her eyes carrying the kind of wisdom that comes from watching your world unmake itself piece by piece. They had heard the Americans were coming for days before they arrived. The sound of artillery grew closer each night, rumbling through the mountains like approaching thunder. German forces, what remained of them, retreated through the town in disorder-tired men with hollow eyes, who no longer believed in anything except the next mile, the next hour. Some threw away their uniforms. Some kept walking east, toward capture or home, or nothing at all. When the Americans entered Berchtesgaden on May 4th, the sisters had been hiding in their root cellar for 36 hours. They had taken what food they could carry and descended into darkness, listening to the world change overhead. Boots marched past. Vehicles rumbled. Voices called out in English. That strange, sharp language they had been taught to fear, told it was the sound of savagery and cultural death. But hunger eventually drives everyone back to the surface. On May 6th, mid-morning, with sunlight streaming through windows, broken by concussive force, the sisters emerged. The street was unrecognizable. American soldiers moved through it with the confidence of conquerors, checking houses, marking doors, establishing control. Jeeps sat at intersections. The American flag hung from the town hall, red and white stripes rippling in mountain air that smelled of pine and burnt things. They were noticed immediately. 2 girls, thin as winter branches, blinking in daylight like creatures from underground. Their clothes were too small, their faces too pale, their eyes too old. An American sergeant approached them, flanked by 2 privates, and spoke words they didn't understand. Greta pushed Anna behind her, an automatic gesture of protection that had become instinct. The sergeant's voice softened. He tried German, broken but functional. "You live here? Parents?" Greta shook her head. "Dead, both dead." The sergeant studied them for a long moment, then nodded to one of his men. "Processing," he said in English, then to the girls, "You come with us? Questions? Then help. Processing." The word meant nothing to them, but the gesture was clear. They were being taken. The building they were brought to had been the local administrative office, a 3-story stone structure that had once housed tax collectors and permit clerks and all the mundane machinery of civic life. Now American soldiers guarded its doors, and inside, the rooms had been converted into what the Americans called screening stations, places where civilians were questioned, identified, categorized, documented. The hallways smelled of disinfectant and coffee, 2 scents the sisters hadn't encountered in years. Electric lights buzzed overhead, powered by American generators. Everywhere, there were German civilians sitting on benches, waiting, faces blank with exhaustion and uncertainty. American soldiers moved between them with clipboards, taking names, checking papers, asking questions. The sisters were separated immediately. "No," Greta said, her first word loud enough to echo. "We stay together." But the American corporal who processed them shook his head, not unkindly. "Standard procedure. Individual interviews. You'll see her after." "She's 12, Greta said, her voice breaking on the number. "She's just a child. That's why we talk to her separate," the corporal explained. "Make sure stories match. Make sure she's safe." He paused, seeming to recognize something in Greta's panic. "Nobody's going to hurt her. Just questions. Then food. Then we find you both somewhere to sleep that ain't a cellar." They were pulled apart gently but firmly, Anna looking back over her shoulder with eyes that asked questions Greta couldn't answer. In that moment, in that stone corridor with sunlight streaming through high windows and strangers in foreign uniforms directing their lives, Greta leaned close to her sister and whispered the words that would haunt them both. "Don't let them see you cry. It was meant to be strength. It was meant to be dignity. It was meant to be the last gift an older sister could give, the armor of stoicism, the power of a controlled face." Anna nodded, tried to straighten her spine, and disappeared through a doorway. Greta was led to a room on the 2nd floor. It was small, formerly some clerk's office, with a single window overlooking the street. A wooden table sat in the center, 2 chairs on either side. The American who entered moments later was a lieutenant, perhaps 25 years old, with the kind of face that suggested kindness had survived despite everything he'd likely seen. He sat down across from her, placed a folder on the table, and offered a smile that didn't quite reach his tired eyes. "My name is Lieutenant Morrison," he said in careful German. "I need to ask you some questions. Are you hungry? Do you need water?" Greta shook her head, though both were lies. Her stomach was a hollow thing, her throat dust, but accepting anything felt like weakness, like admission. Morrison opened the folder. Inside were blank forms, spaces waiting to be filled with the details of her existence. "Your full name?" "Greta Maria Hoffman." "Age?" 16, 17 in July. "Parents?" "Dead." "How?" The question was simple, but the answer was an abyss. "My mother died of typhus. Winter of 1943. My father went east with the army. We received notification of his death in the summer of 1942, near Smolensk." Morrison wrote carefully, his handwriting neat. "And you've been alone since then? You and your sister?" "Yes." "How did you survive? How did they survive?" The question was too large for words. They survived by eating potato peels and dandelion leaves. They survived by burning furniture for heat when the coal ran out. They survived by avoiding the authorities who might have separated them, placed them in institutions, redistributed them like property. They survived by becoming invisible, by learning which days the farmer's wife might have extra bread, by discovering which cellars still had preserves from before the war. How? "We managed," Greta said. Morrison looked up from his notes, and something in his expression shifted. Perhaps he recognized the inadequacy of the question, the impossibility of the answer. You did more than manage. You kept your sister alive. That's not nothing. Greta felt something crack inside her chest. Some wall she built brick by brick over 2 years of being the only adult in a child's body. She blinked hard, focused on the wood grain of the table, counted the knots until the feeling passed. What happens now? She asked. That depends, Morrison said. Were you or your sister involved with any party organizations? The youth groups? I was in the League of German Girls, Greta admitted. Before my mother died, they made everyone join. We sang songs. We learned to cook for large groups. That was all. Did you believe what they taught you? The question hung in the air like smoke. Did she believe? Once, perhaps. When she was 10, and the world was bright uniforms and promises of belonging, when the leaders spoke with such certainty about destiny and greatness and the natural order of things. But belief is a luxury sustained by full stomachs and stable homes, and both had abandoned her long ago. I believed I wanted to survive, she said finally. I believed my sister needed me. Everything else was just noise. Morrison studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Your sister? Anna, correct? Yes. She's being interviewed right now by Lieutenant Fisher. He's good with children. Gentle. She be scared. I know. Morrison set down his pen. That's why we separate families sometimes. Not to be cruel, but to see if the stories align. To make sure there's no ... coercion. No one being forced to lie for someone else. I would never... I don't think you would, Morrison interrupted gently. But we've seen things. Parents forcing children to cover for them. Wives protecting husbands who did terrible things. We have to be sure. Greta understood the logic, but logic didn't stop the fear that clawed at her ribs. Anna was alone in a room with a stranger, being asked questions she might not know how to answer, and Greta couldn't protect her from the wrong word, the wrong memory, the wrong truth. The interview continued. Morrison asked about their house, their neighbors, whether they had seen anything unusual in the final days of the war. He asked if any fleeing officials had sought shelter with them, if they had hidden anything, if they knew of anyone who had been part of the regime's inner circles. Greta answered honestly, because honesty was the only currency she had left. No, they had hidden no one. No, they had nothing of value. Yes, they had seen some soldiers throw away their uniforms, but she didn't know their names or where they went. Yes, there had been officials in town, but they had never spoken to 2 orphaned girls who lived on the edge of everything. Time moved strangely in that room. Sunlight shifted across the floor, marking minutes or hours. Greta couldn't tell. Morrison filled out his forms with methodical care, occasionally pausing to ask for clarification or to explain why he needed certain information. Finally, he closed the folder. All right, he said. I think that's everything I need. You and your sister will be processed as displaced persons. We'll provide temporary housing, food rations, and medical assessment. Eventually, if you have family elsewhere, we can help you relocate. If not, there are organizations that help orphans. Orphans. The word landed like a stone. They had been orphans for 2 years, but somehow having an American lieutenant say it in an official capacity made it real in a way it hadn't been before. Can I see Anna now? Morrison stood. Let me check on her status. He left, and Greta was alone in the room with its single window and its view of a world that had moved on without asking permission. She walked to the glass and looked down at the street below. American soldiers directed traffic. German civilians moved with the careful neutrality of the defeated. Somewhere in these mountains, in these valleys, spring was doing its work, and the dead were becoming names, and the living were becoming survivors, and the distance between the two was the width of a heartbeat. The door opened, but it wasn't Morrison. It was Anna. She stood in the doorway, her face crumpled like paper that had been smoothed out too many times. Tears carved channels through the dust on her cheeks, catching light like silver threads. Her whole body shook with the kind of crying that comes from the center of the earth, from the place where all the held-back grief lives. Behind her, Lieutenant Fisher stood with a hand on her shoulder, his expression a mixture of compassion and professional concern. He was older than Morrison, perhaps 40, with the kind of eyes that suggested he had children of his own somewhere. Greta moved without thinking, crossing the room in 3 steps and pulling Anna into her arms. The younger girl collapsed against her, making sounds that weren't quite words, her fingers digging into Greta C's back like she was drowning, and this was the only solid thing in the world. "I'm sorry," Anna gasped between sobs. "I'm sorry. I tried not to." Greta whispered, her own vision blurring. It's okay. But it wasn't okay, because now Greta was crying too. All the careful control she'd maintained through the interview, all the walls she'd built, all the strength she'd marshaled. It cracked apart like ice in spring. She cried for their mother, who had died calling their names. She cried for their father, who was bones in Russian earth. She cried for 2 years of being strong when she wanted to be weak, of being an adult when she was still a child, of carrying weight that should have been shared. The sisters stood in that room, holding each other and breaking apart together, while 2 American officers watched with the kind of silence that suggested they understood some things transcended language and nationality and war. Lieutenant Fisher spoke quietly to Morrison. She held it together until I asked about her parents, then about how she and her sister survived. She just ... unraveled. Morrison nodded. Same with the older one. Been holding it for years, probably. Poor kids. Yeah, the Americans gave them time. That, more than anything else, would stay with Greta, that these men who could have hurried them along, who had 100 other people to process, who had no obligation to care, instead just let them cry. Morrison left and returned with tissues, with 2 cups of water, with a kindness that didn't ask for anything in return. Eventually, the tears slowed. Anna's breathing steadied. Greta wiped her sister's face with the heel of her hand, the gesture so familiar it was almost automatic. "You told me not to cry," Anna whispered. "I know. I tried. I know. But he was so nice. He asked if I missed my mother, and I just COULDN single quotes T ... Greta pulled back enough to look at her sister's face, that young face that had seen too much. "It's okay to cry," she said, the words feeling like truth for the first time. "We don't have to be strong anymore." "Not like that." Anna nodded, then looked past Greta to where the 2 Americans stood. "Are they going to hurt us?" Lieutenant Fisher stepped forward, kneeling slightly so he was at eye level with Anna. "No," he said in German that was better than Morrison's. "No one is going to hurt you. We're going to help you. Food, shelter, safety. That's all. You promise?" Fisher glanced at Morrison, then back to Anna. "I promise. On my own daughter's life, I promise." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Anna studied him for a long moment, and nodded, some tension leaving her small shoulders. What happened next happened quickly, with the efficiency of military logistics applied to humanitarian need. The sisters were taken to a medical station where a weary army doctor examined them, noting malnutrition, minor infections, the physical toll of survival. They were given new clothes from a relief supply depot, American-made dresses that were too large but clean and whole. They were assigned to temporary housing in a requisitioned hotel that had been converted into a displaced persons facility. But before all that, they were taken to a mess hall. The smell hit them before they entered the building. Cooking meat, fresh bread, coffee, scents so foreign after years of scarcity that they were almost painful. Inside, American soldiers sat at long tables, eating meals that seemed impossible in their abundance. A sergeant directed them to a serving line. A cook, a black American man with tired eyes and quick hands, piled their plates with food. Beef stew, mashed potatoes, green beans, white bread with butter, a piece of chocolate cake. Anna stared at her plate like it might disappear if she blinked. They sat at an empty table near a window. Neither spoke. They ate slowly at first, then faster, then had to stop because their stomachs, shrunken by years of want, couldn't process abundance. Greta ate half her cake and wrapped the rest in a napkin, an automatic gesture of hoarding for later, for when the plenty ended. American soldiers watched them from other tables, their expressions ranging from curiosity to pity to something softer. A private approached, young enough to still have acne, and set 2 bottles of Coca-Cola on their table without saying a word. He nodded once and walked away. That night, in their assigned room on the 3rd floor of the hotel, lying in actual beds with clean sheets, Anna spoke into the darkness. "Greta?" "Yes?" "I'm sorry," I cried. Greta rolled over to face her sister's bed, though she could barely see her in the dim light. "Don't be. You told me not to let them see." "I was wrong," Greta said quietly. "I thought we had to hide everything to survive. But maybe surviving means being allowed to feel things again. To be sad when we're sad. To be scared when we're scared. To cry when we need to cry." Anna was quiet for a moment. "Do you think Father would be proud of us?" The question pierced something deep in Greta's chest. "Yes," she said, her voice catching. "Yes, I think he would be. We survived. We kept each other alive. That's what he would have wanted. Do you think it's really over?" "The war?" "Yes. What happens now?" Greta didn't have an answer for that. The future was a blank space, as unknowable as the darkness in their room. But for the first time in years, the darkness didn't feel quite so threatening. Somewhere in this building, American soldiers stood guard. Somewhere in this town, systems were being established to help people like them. Somewhere in this broken world, there were still men like Morrison and Fisher who kept their promises. "I don't know what happens now," Greta admitted, "but we'll face it together. Like always." "Together," Anna repeated, and in her voice was something that might have been hope. The next days unfolded with a strange mixture of chaos and routine. The Americans processed hundreds of displaced persons, German civilians whose homes had been destroyed, refugees from the East, forced laborers freed from work camps, children separated from parents in the Exodus. The sisters found themselves part of a tide of humanity trying to remake itself from ruins. They were interviewed again by different officers, each checking the details, building files, establishing identities in a world where documentation had been destroyed and lies were easier than truth. But the questions became routine, the fear diminished, and gradually the sisters began to understand that the Americans were not the monsters they had been taught to expect. Lieutenant Morrison visited them twice more. The first time, he brought news that they had confirmed their parents' deaths through cross-referenced records, making them officially orphaned wards requiring relocation assistance. The second time, he brought photographs. "We're documenting everything," he explained. "Every displaced person, every orphan. These will go into your files. Help us track you if you get moved. Help family find you if anyone's looking." The photographer was a corporal with gentle hands who posed them in front of a blank wall. "Smile if you can," he said in broken German. "Or don't, whatever feels right." They didn't smile. The photograph shows 2 girls standing side by side, Greta's hand on Anna's shoulder, both looking at the camera with a kind of expression that speaks of exhaustion and endurance. Their faces are clean, their clothes new, but their eyes carry the weight of everything they've survived. That photograph would eventually make its way to the National Archives, one of thousands documenting the displaced persons of 1945, a small piece of evidence that 2 sisters had existed, had survived, had stood. For a moment in front of a camera, and allowed themselves to be seen. Lieutenant Fisher, the man who had interviewed Anna, became a regular presence in their lives during those weeks. He had 2 daughters back in Pennsylvania, he told them, ages 10 and 14, and he saw something of them in the Hoffman sisters. He brought them small gifts when he could, a deck of cards, a book in German, once a stuffed rabbit he'd found in an abandoned shop. "For when you feel scared at night," he said to Anna, pressing the rabbit into her hands. Something to hold on to. Anna clutched it like treasure, and for the first time since their mother's death, she slept through the night without waking. The American occupation force established order quickly in Berchtesgaden and the surrounding region. They cleared rubble, restored utilities, set up supply chains. German civilians were put to work, some grudgingly, some gratefully, rebuilding what war had torn down. The sisters were too young for labor assignments, but helped where they could, sorting donated clothes, organizing supplies in the relief depot, translating when their limited English allowed. They met other children in the displaced persons facility, orphans like themselves, survivors of different tragedies, but bound by the common experience of loss. There was Klaus, whose entire family had died in an air raid on Dresden. There was Maria, whose parents had been resistance members executed by the regime. There was Wolfgang, who had walked 300 miles from Berlin after the Russian assault, surviving on whatever he could find. These children became a tribe of sorts, bound not by ideology or propaganda, but by the simple fact of having endured. They taught each other survival tricks, shared food when someone was struggling, kept watch when nightmares came. The Americans let them be, understanding that sometimes healing happens in community, in the presence of others who don't need explanations. One evening in late May, as sunset painted the Alps gold and crimson, Greta and Anna sat on the steps of the hotel and watched the town come to life in new ways. American soldiers played baseball in a cleared lot. German civilians walked past in ordered lines, heading home from work assignments. The smell of cooking food drifted from the mess hall. "Do you remember when we thought they would kill us?" Anna asked quietly. Greta remembered. She remembered hiding in the cellar, listening to the approaching army, certain that this was the end, that everything they'd survived had been only prelude to final violence. "I remember," she said. "They fed us instead." Yes. Why did they lie to us about what the Americans were like? It was the question every German child was asking in those days, the question that had no simple answer. Why had they been taught to fear when they should have understood? Why had truth been replaced with propaganda? Why had the adults in their lives chosen lies over reality? "Because people in power lie when they're afraid," Greta said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke it. "They knew if we saw Americans as human beings like us, we might question everything else they told us. So they made them into monsters, made us into us, and them into them. Made it easier to fight, easier to hate. But they're just people. Yes, just people. Some good, some bad. Like anywhere." Anna leaned against her sister's shoulder, the gesture casual and trusting. "I like that better. People instead of monsters. It's less scary." Greta wrapped an arm around her sister and watched the sun continue its descent behind the mountains. In a month, they would be relocated to a more permanent displaced persons camp. In a year, they would be adopted by distant relatives in Stuttgart. In 2 years, Anna would be back in regular school, learning mathematics and history. In 5 years, they would have something approaching normal lives again. But none of that mattered in this moment. What mattered was sitting on stone steps in the fading light, bellies full, bodies warm, together and alive. "Greta?" Anna said quietly. "Yes, thank you." "For what?" "For keeping us alive. For being strong when I couldn't be. For being my sister." Greta felt tears prick her eyes again, but this time they didn't feel like breaking. They felt like release, like rain after drought. "We kept each other alive," she said. That's what sisters do. They sat until full darkness fell, and an American sergeant came to tell them it was time for lights out. They climbed 3 flights of stairs to their room, washed their faces in the communal bathroom, changed into night clothes that were too large but clean. Before sleep, Anna spoke once more into the darkness. Do you think we'll always remember this? The crying? The interrogation? Greta considered the question. Memory was a strange thing, keeping some moments and releasing others, shaping the past into narrative. Would they remember the fear in that corridor? The whispered instruction not to cry? The breaking down of walls they'd built to survive? Yes, she said finally. But I think maybe we'll remember what came after too. The kindness, the food, the safety. All of it together. The hard parts and the healing parts. Good, Anna murmured, already drifting toward sleep. I want to remember Lieutenant Fisher, and the chocolate cake, and the stuffed rabbit. We'll remember, Greta promised. All of it. She lay awake longer, listening to her sister's breathing even out, watching shadows play across the ceiling. In the distance, she could hear American soldiers talking and laughing, sounds of normalcy that had once been foreign and frightening. Now they were simply the sounds of people existing in the world, no more or less than that. The years to come would bring their own challenges. There would be trauma to process, grief to carry, a divided Germany to navigate. There would be questions about guilt and complicity, about what it meant to have been German during those years, about how to build a future from the ruins of a poisoned past. But in that moment, in that room, with her sister safe and sleeping, Greta allowed herself to believe that survival had been worth it, that the morning they emerged from the cellar had been the first day of something new, not the last day of something old, that 2 sisters who had been taught to hide their tears might someday learn to show their joy. Outside, the Alps stood silent and eternal, having seen empires rise and fall, having watched generations come and go. They had seen war sweep through these valleys and peace return. They had seen 2 young girls walk out of darkness into light, out of fear into something like hope. The mountains kept their vigil. The stars wheeled overhead. And in a requisitioned hotel in a defeated town, 2 sisters slept without nightmares for the first time in years, while American soldiers stood guard and the world slowly began the work of putting itself back together. Years later, when they were grown women with children of their own, the sisters would tell this story. They would describe the corridor where Greta whispered her instruction. They would talk about breaking down in front of strangers who had every reason to be their enemies, but chose kindness instead. They would remember the taste of chocolate cake and the weight of a stuffed rabbit and the sound of American voices that had once seemed like threat, but became, instead, the sound of salvation. Don't let them see you cry, Greta had said, thinking strength meant hiding. But sometimes the greatest strength is allowing yourself to break in front of those who will help you heal. Sometimes tears are not weakness, but witness. Sometimes the end of one world is the beginning of another. And sometimes 2 sisters standing in a stone corridor, holding on to each other, while everything they knew dissolved around them, are not just surviving, but becoming something new, people who understand that compassion can cross the lines drawn by war, that humanity persists even in the darkest times, that the future is always being written by those brave enough to face it honestly. The war ended in Bavaria in May 1945. But for Greta and Anna Hoffmann, something else began, a life where tears were allowed, where strangers could be kind, where chocolate cake was possible, where tomorrow might be different from yesterday. They carried that beginning forward, year by year, step by step, together as they had always been, as they would always be, sisters, survivors, witnesses to the moment when everything broke and then slowly, impossibly, began to heal.